This is the radio signal, written by Barrel Coops. The ultimate short story thriller.
The cold in the attic felt as if it had been there forever. It had soaked into the floorboards, soaked into the walls, and now it was permeating into the marrow of Jack Halley's bones. For 3 days, he hadn't moved from his post, barely shifting except to scratch the coded notes into his pad or adjust the crackling receiver beside him to tune into the signal. It wasn't the first time he'd hidden above a bakery in the middle of nowhere. But this was different. This time he was in Normandy, and it was June of 1944. And the world was about to be tipped on its axis.
The radio spat out static, then fell quiet yet again. Jack leant in to hear the faint signal. He pressed the earphones harder against his ears. The sound came again. It was faint, but he was right. He had heard the measured clicking. Morse code. At this hour, it had to be important. He scribbled as the transmission came in. Dashes, dots, a pause, and then another burst. He'd memorized hundreds of call signs in his time, and he knew this one didn't belong to any he recognized. But the message was unmistakable once he had decoded it. An Allied paratrooper unit was being lured into a trap northeast of Carentan. A German unit had intercepted one of their supply drops and copied the signal. They were now impersonating resistance fighters. The drop zone had been compromised. If the squad landed now, they'd be walking straight into machine gun fire. Jack blinked at the page, his stomach roiled. This couldn't be happening. Had someone in the resistance been turned or broken under torture? Or was it something even worse? He didn't know. Either way, he had just minutes, not hours, to make the decision. He reached for the transmitter, but then froze. There were no orders authorizing him to respond. His role was strictly to receive, not to initiate contact. Should he do it? But sending an unsanctioned message could expose his location. If the Germans picked up the signal, they'd triangulate the source in minutes. It was not that he had a pre-planned escape route, and the attic wouldn't save him. Neither would the old woman downstairs who baked bread for the locals and slipped him crusty ends when the smell got too strong to ignore. He sat there. He had to make a decision one way or the other, he thought as he watched his fingers twitch just above the switch. He knew the right thing to do. If he didn't warn them, a full unit of Allied soldiers would be slaughtered within the hour. But if he did, he might not last the night. His mind raced through the protocol, trying to find a loophole, but there wasn't one he could think of. Technically, he'd be violating direct orders. But on the other hand, he didn't have time to wait for clearance from London, not with the drop scheduled for just before sunrise. Jack wiped the sweat from his brow. Then he grabbed the pad, flipped to a clean page, and started coding his own message, even knowing what this could mean to him. Allied Unit Zulu 4, drop zone compromised. Do not deploy. Repeat, do not deploy. Enemy masquerading as local cell. He kept it short, but it had to be clean and urgent. He flipped the switch. The transmission took 25 seconds. That was all it needed to be. Shorter than a prayer, even quieter than a scream, but loud enough to save dozens of lives and give away his position. He released the key, and the attic fell into silence again. Now all he could do was wait. 2 hours later, just before dawn, the sound of boots on gravel reached his ears. They found him. He pressed his body against the floorboards, trying to slow his breathing. The old woman below hadn't stirred yet. She was hard of hearing and slept like the dead, but someone was definitely outside. The gravel shifted again. He heard it this time, clear as day. Then came a sharp rap on the bakery door. 3 knocks. Pause. 2 knocks. It wasn't the resistance code. He reached for his sidearm that lay on the table. Downstairs, the door creaked open. Jack didn't dare move. The old woman's voice filtered up. It was soft and sounded confused. A man's voice answered, in German. Then another, and another. 3 soldiers, maybe even 4. He heard the scrape of chairs below him, the bang of a pot hitting the floor. They were pretending to search casually, and they were making small talk, but it was too precise and too careful. This wasn't a routine patrol. They were stalling. They knew someone was here. He didn't have to wait long. The trapdoor to the attic groaned open before he could reach the back wall. A pale, round face rose slowly through the trapdoor. It was a young German soldier. He had barely looked up before Jack's boots slammed into his jaw, knocking him back down the ladder. Shouts erupted from below. The radio in the corner sparked as a stray bullet tore through the floorboard near it. Jack dove behind a stack of flour sacks just as a second soldier appeared, his rifle raised. Jack fired once, and the man dropped without a sound. The room filled with gunfire. Wood splintered. Jack crawled low, keeping his shoulder tucked as he reloaded. They weren't shooting to kill, not at the moment anyway. They wanted him alive. Probably for interrogation. Maybe worse. He grabbed the satchel he always kept packed and bolted for the crawl space near the chimney. He barely fit through it, scraping his ribs on the jagged brick as he shoved his way out onto the roof. The pre-dawn light made everything ghostly. Fields stretched out like frozen seas. Smoke coiled lazily from chimneys across the village. No one was awake yet. No one who could help. Behind him, voices shouted through the attic. Boots thudded across floorboards. Jack ran. He jumped onto the next rooftop, barely catching his footing. Another jump. This one almost cost him his ankle. He felt the pull of the satchel's strap, heard the rip of fabric, and almost dropped the coded message. He stuffed it into his coat just in time. A bullet whined past his head. Another cracked the tiles near his feet. They were firing from the street now. He didn't stop. He hit the edge of the final roof and saw what he needed. A hay wagon parked against the barn below. Without thinking, he leapt. He landed hard. The breath punched from his lungs. But he was still moving. He rolled out of the hay and took off across the fields, keeping low. The old escape path the resistance had mapped for him, the dry creek bed that led to the woods. It wasn't far. If he could just reach it before the dogs came. A shout rang out behind him, but Jack didn't look back. By sunrise, he was miles away, mud-soaked, scraped, and bleeding from the elbow, but alive. He sat beneath a copse of trees, his body aching in every direction. In his coat pocket, the coded message was damp with sweat, but intact. The transmission had gone out. Whether it was received, he didn't know. But he'd made the call. He'd broken protocol, lit a flare in the dark, and probably signed his own death warrant in the process. But if even one paratrooper pulled up before hitting the ground, it was worth it. And if not, then there was more work to do. Jack didn't stop moving for the rest of the day. By late afternoon, he was deep in the hedgerows that clawed through Normandy like ancient scars. The terrain was tight and unfamiliar, but it gave him cover. Thick, tangled brush and centuries-old stone walls that muffled the sound of his footsteps. He knew from his training that German patrols stuck to the open fields and roads. These narrow green tunnels were too slow, too exposed for them. But for someone like Jack, someone desperate to disappear, they were salvation. His legs ached, his shoulder throbbed from the rooftop landing, and his last swallow of water had been hours ago. Still, he pushed on. He had to reach the fallback point. If London had received his unsanctioned message, and that was still a big if, it would trigger a new rendezvous protocol. A secondary contact point, just in case everything else went to hell. Which it had. The resistance had set it up weeks ago, before anyone knew D-Day would be so close. A disused barn northeast of Sainte-Mère-Église, remote, forgotten, but known to a single local agent, code-named Violin. Jack had never met her, only heard whispers. But if anyone could get him out, it'd be her. And if she wasn't there, then he'd be on his own. Again. By nightfall, the barn appeared in the distance, crouched low against the earth like a wounded animal. The last light of day was slipping away, and with it, any sense of safety. Jack approached slowly, checking the surrounding brush for movement, then the windows. No glint of glass, no shadows, just silence. He knocked twice, then once, then 3 more in quick succession. Nothing. He was about to turn away when the door cracked open and a narrow face appeared. Older than he'd imagined. Tired eyes, dirt on her cheek, hair pinned back in a scarf the color of ash. "You're early," she said quietly. Jack blinked. "Your violin?" She raised a brow. "You expecting an orchestra?" He managed a short breath of a laugh and stepped inside. The barn smelled of hay and rust. Maps had been nailed to the wall, and a low table was stacked with field radios, coded logs, and weapons wrapped in cloth. A makeshift operations room built from scraps. "You were burned," she said flatly, not looking at him. "Yes. And yet here you are." "I warned them," Jack replied. "Sent the message myself." "Without orders?" "Yes." She glanced at him. "That was either brave or incredibly stupid." "Maybe both." Violin walked over to one of the radios and adjusted the dial. Static filled the air, followed by a faint transmission. British frequency. Jack froze. "They got your message," she said. "The drop was scrubbed. Unit rerouted. They're alive." He sat down slowly. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a narrow escape from something too large to see. "You probably bought yourself a death sentence," she added. "They'll come looking." "I know." "But you saved them?" Jack looked up. "What now?" She didn't answer immediately, just turned back to the table and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. Coordinates, names, a list of supply caches and known collaborators. "We're moving," she said. "Tonight. We have a bigger job now." He frowned. "Bigger than warning a drop zone." She handed him the paper. "We've intercepted something. A high-level German officer is being moved under cover near Bayeux. The resistance believes he's one of the architects behind their counterintelligence operations, the one who's been feeding disinformation to our networks. If we can get to him—" Jack didn't let her finish. "Then we stop the next trap before it's even set." Violin nodded. There was no time to waste. They moved under cover of darkness. Just the two of them at first, weaving through villages too small to have names. Violin led the way, never once hesitating, never once needing a map. She carried a silenced pistol tucked in her coat, and Jack suspected she knew how to use it better than most of the soldiers he'd trained with. By sunrise, they reached a tiny farmhouse just outside Bayeux. From there, they joined up with two more resistance fighters, a wiry teenager with eyes too old for his face, and a one-legged ex-schoolteacher with a rifle longer than his arm. No one exchanged names. They didn't need to. The officer was being held in a commandeered chateau half a mile north, guarded by a rotating squad of Wehrmacht troops. His convoy was due to move in 24 hours. That gave them one chance to intercept him during a scheduled switch in the guard detail when the perimeter would be thinnest. It was madness. But so was the war. That night, Jack lay beneath the stars, staring up at the quiet sky, thinking of London, of the half-written letters in his locker back at HQ, of the faces of men he'd trained with, some already gone. He didn't know if he'd survive tomorrow, but somehow that wasn't the point anymore. What mattered was that his message had made it. The men had lived. The war would go on. And if he had to keep running, keep choosing the harder path, again and again, then so be it. He wasn't a hero, just a man who made a call when it counted. The assault was over in under 10 minutes. Violin's team hit the south side of the chateau with Molotovs and small arms fire, drawing the guards away. Jack and the schoolteacher breached from the rear through the wine cellar. Smoke filled the hallways. Glass shattered. The German officer tried to escape through a side passage, but Jack caught him mid-run, wrestled him to the ground, and shoved the barrel of his pistol against the man's jaw. The German froze. The resistance fighters closed in. Within the hour, the officer was bound, gagged, and on a one-way trip to the coast, and eventually London. He would talk. They always did. And Jack? He disappeared again. 3 weeks later, in a nondescript hallway in London, Jack Halley stood before his commanding officer, waiting for the verdict. There were no formal charges, but there was no commendation either. Just a nod of appreciation, a quiet word of thanks behind closed doors, and a new assignment for him, and yet another identity, in another country, another mission. His actions would never appear in the official reports. He knew that. There'd be no medals for him to acknowledge his quick thinking, and of course, no ceremony. But as he stepped out into the cold English rain, Jack knew one thing. He hadn't saved the world, but he'd saved the men who still might, and that was enough for him.
This was The Radio Signal.
Written and produced by Beryl Coops. I hope you enjoyed my short story. Please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. I am hoping to release a new one every week to 10 days. Everything from spy, stories, mystery, thriller, humor, futuristic, fantasy, period drama, and romance. Something for everyone. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a thumbs up. It helps others find my channel.